Hello and welcome to the Rubber Duck Dev Show. I'm Chris,
I'm Creston.
and as you can see, I've cut Creston's face off for one thing.
See you later.
I don't know how that happened. Anyway, um, yeah. So you'll also notice that we don't have a third person here with us. That's because somebody, I won't name any names, um, got overloaded past couple of weeks and didn't book any guests for show.
We can just call this the Rubber Duck Dev Show Classic version.
Yeah, there you go. Classic. Um, so yeah, I will be reaching out to some folks for December because I don't. The only person I have booked at this point is Ernesto is coming on the 30th of November to be with us and talk about some stuff, which is great. I'm really looking forward to that. But I had him booked a while back, and I have just fallen so far behind. So I will be reaching out to beg people to to help me out and agree to come on the show in December. But anyway, tonight we're going to talk about something we kind of mentioned last week, and that is active record callbacks, database callbacks. Are they good or evil? So we'll kind of discuss that and talk about the fun things that they are. But before we get into that tonight, a week in review. Preston, how was your week?
Super busy, doing a lot of consulting related stuff. Not so much product stuff, even though I want to get back to the product stuff, but I've been doing so much consulting work, it's been hard to do that. Hey Colin, how you doing?
Hey, Colin.
Interesting thing as I'm working on different things, I'm finding I much prefer being more, and we'll talk probably more about this today, being explicit versus something implicitly happening. So I've come to dislike, magic that happens, like something unexplained. And yeah, it's hard to say it's magic happening because you can always look at the source code to understand what's going on. But when things do too much for me, I actually start to not like it as much. But anyway,
Yeah.
it's just something I'm realizing about myself. But we'll talk a little bit more about that with this topic.
Yep.
What about you?
I've also had a really busy week. I mean, that's probably going to be a common theme for most people out there because it's end of year and people in the crunch time trying to get projects done and all that stuff. A lot of companies, mine included, have code freezes around the holidays, and so we've got a code freeze coming up. So I'm trying to jam projects in and get things finished up, but still done well. Fast is not the most important.
My clients actually announced, okay, we're not doing a freeze, but it's a code frost. So we're just slowing down.
Stay frosty.
We're not locking you out, but just things are going to be slower. You take, be more cautious, etc.
Yeah. So, I've been jamming around trying to get things done and organize. I've got my hands on a lot of projects and doing project management and actual engineering and coordination with big customers, and so I've just been headless chicken for a couple of weeks now, which is why I don't have any guests booked. I haven't had time to breathe, much less deal with booking guests. So, hey, Twitter friends, anybody out there wants to volunteer to come on the show and talk about something in December, some Wednesday, I'm all ears. But I will be reaching out. Anyway, yeah. So it's been really busy, but good. I'm looking forward to the holidays. I'm taking some time off Thanksgiving. I'm taking some time off Christmas. So it'll be nice and relaxed. I am actually
we sorry, go ahead.
I am actually on call Christmas Day and New Year's Eve, so that could be a little dicey, but it's all good.
And we will not have a show on Thanksgiving, and I'm sure maybe one or two shows closer to the Christmas time.
Right. Hey, Rick. Welcome to the show. So DB callbacks, active record callbacks specifically is what we're talking about. Good or evil? Evil. Good night, all. No, this is something that this is a topic that's been debated for a long time, and there's a lot of difference between this topic on a whiteboard and this topic in a practical environment, right? So yeah, I agree, Rick. I think you'll find I agree with that mostly. So mostly. I mean, there are definitely times when they're useful, right? But you have to be extraordinarily careful with them. And a month ago, I was fighting really hard with one of our big apps that's, really like the central core app, and it's got tons of stuff in it, lots of lines of code. And I just had a hell of a time dealing with some old database callbacks and trying to troubleshoot an issue and test things because the bloody active record callbacks were just abused, basically, is the best word I can come up with for it. So, we want to talk about, well, when would you use them and when wouldn't you use them, and should you use them at all? So I guess the first the first fundamental question I will pose to Creston and to chat is, should you ever use active record callbacks in a Rails project that's bigger than Hello World?
I think that you can, but here's the issue is there's one word that I kind of wrote down to remember to say, is that they're insidious. In other words, it's a very dangerous slope you get when you start using them. Got someone in the chat saying,
yeah. So Rick says, I tend to only use before save to coordinate between fields in the same model. That is exactly my feeling. So there are, and it's interesting you say that, because what I've found is the before whatever callbacks are usually not as dangerous as the after callbacks. And the reason for that is the before callbacks usually are only dealing with stuff in that model, setting defaults for a field, or, like you say, coordinating between fields in that model. Where it gets nasty most of the time that I see is in the after callbacks. Hey, after you save this order, now go and deliver this email and go do this thing and go do this thing. And it's reaching all over the place and just completely violating the single responsibility principle. Like, hey, actually, I mean, this example isn't a before save, but it's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Hey, before I save this order, get the total from the line items. Well, as soon as I do that, I have to know about line items, which takes me outside of this model, and that gets nasty. Okay, great. So now what if my line items have callbacks, right? And this is kind of what I ran into, is it was this just endless stream of callbacks that I ended up having to trace down across many models. And that's just impossible, not to mention the fact that testing that crap is horrifically difficult. And even when it's not difficult, it's horrifically slow. Because if I'm trying to test a specific thing about a model, but every time I create that model, it's got to create 85 other objects, right? That's just going to slow your tests way down. That's just nasty. So
yeah, that's the kind of thing, what I was saying about it's insidious. So why do callbacks exist? Well, basically Rails tries to make things convenient, and you create an object, you make a change to the object, you save that object. And it all kind of happens like somebody new to Rails, it all kind of happens and just flows through. Well, they added these callbacks to say, oh, but wait, what if I want to change something before I save it? Or what if I want to do something before things are validated and it saves it to the database? So that's why these callbacks were introduced. So, but the problem is that once you start doing it, you start coming up with all these different other reasons to do it, and it becomes a dangerous slope and becomes insidious. It's kind of what I was going towards.
Right.
It goes
Um,
back to it's kind of magical how it all works. You
yeah.
know, hey, I created an object within Ruby and I just call this save call, and now everything is saved to the database table just fine. Well, then they had to introduce callbacks for you to be able to jump in there somewhere. And that essentially can cause issues depending on how much you add to it. Like you were saying about the line items and going somewhere else, and then those trigger callbacks, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And that happens really quickly when you start building a system, because you think, oh, I'll just add a callback here. It's no big deal. And then, a week later, you're working on this other model. Oh, I'll just add a callback here, without thinking about the fact that the callback you just added is going to get triggered from this other callback, which gets triggered from this other callback. And you've just built a chain of hell, basically. So Rick says, I do use after commit to add a listener, where the listener is just some poro thing. That way I can test the behavior of the listener separately, and it doesn't always run during tests. That's probably fine in most cases. That seems reasonable to me. I haven't personally done that, but that sounds reasonable. But yeah, I mean, as long as your callbacks aren't reaching out to other objects, the way I usually tend to think about it is, if I have to do something with another object, when I'm doing something with this object, I should have a higher order object that does those two things. They shouldn't be talking to each other. So if I have a order completer object, it can save the order, or it can get the totals from the line items and then pass that to the order and save the order.
And then ideally, you may need to also have some transactional integrity with regard to that. And you're not going to get that with callbacks,
Right.
but you could get that, do everything within a transaction, adding up line items if they presumably could change and then generate your total.
Right. And the other thing that I've noticed a lot of times is that this kind of breeds a bad habit of, depending on these callbacks. And I mean, it's not just active records callbacks where I see this. It has to do with validations and stuff too. But depending on these callbacks, to keep your actual database clean, and so people end up not putting the right things in the database layer itself, right? Like, hey, this can't ever be null. Well, if the only time you're checking that is in a callback or in a validation, what happens if somebody runs a query or somebody writes an API to your stuff that doesn't run through that object? Your database is going to get hosed. So I see a lot of percolating up of things that should be in the database coming up to the active record layer with things like callbacks, and that's dangerous, frankly. Forget confusing and slow, dangerous. You can really screw up your database like that.
Well, what do you think, out of curiosity, what do you think about being more explicit where, say, you have a controller action and it calls a separate method that actually handles, like, say, a scenario where you want to change what a value is and store a mutated version of that value in another column, that you might use for before validation. Hey, I want to save this in a different format based upon pre-existing data that's being sent. What about doing that in your own, explicitly in your own object, your own method in some type of object, and then calling save from there so you avoid a callback?
Yeah, and I mean, on the surface, that sounds like a perfect example of something you'd want to do with a callback based on the glossy brochures. But that's the kind of insidious stuff you were talking about where, oh, this isn't a big deal. I'll just do it here. And then 3 months later, you've done 1,000 of those things and it's a mess. So yeah, even in cases like that, I think it's better to explicitly do that in your code um, either put a method on your model that does that interpolation or translation or
Right,
whatever it is
right.
you need to do, and then call that from a higher order object, right? So I've got this order. Hey, order, set your other thing field based on this field. Hey, order, save yourself.
Yep.
Um, so I mean, callbacks. I've just gotten to the point where I no longer see cases where I want to use a callback over anything else. I just don't have those situations anymore. Because every time I've used callbacks or every time I've seen them used, it's ended up biting me in the butt and been a pain in the ass. So I just avoid them like the plague anymore. Um,
Yeah, it's really easy to start using them because they're available and there's the reason why they were created, and it's easy to start using them, but they're insidious because down the road, they're eventually going to get you into trouble, probably.
it has every time for me. Um, and not only because it can create complicated webs of troubleshooting nightmares, but because it creates a bad habit. People fall into this habit of, hey, I've got this active record layer, I don't need to do the proper things to my database layer, and that gets dangerous. um, your database should always, if this needs to be one of certain values, you've got an enumerable in there and it can only be one of three things. Well, your database should check that, because you don't want a query trying to put stuff in there and putting things wrong. The database should throw that up wherever it's coming from. And I think these active record things are causing people to lose sight of that in a lot of cases. Been my experience anyway. Now,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that active record callbacks were a bad idea or that they are evil in and of themselves, but I don't think a lot of developers look at them the right way, and they end up being kind of a shortcut and a crutch.
Well, it's
To
definitely it's the easy path
Yeah,
that may lead to problems down the road because it's the easiest thing in the world to put like, hey, if you want to change something before something's validated, oh, there's before validation. There you go.
right,
Done. Ship that feature.
right. And we had a case where we've got a very large set of structures in our code base, right? I mean, there's hundreds of models in this thing and lots of relationships, and they all, kind of talk with each other, which is just kind of bad in and of itself. They shouldn't be talking to each other. Something should be talking to the two of them. But we had a case where there were so many, and this is a really old code base. So, I mean, it's been around since like Rails 1 point something brother. So, it's got the long in the tooth syndrome.
It's got the cruft.
Right, exactly. Um, but we we have this thing where we do an import. We did a custom import of some data, recurring import, like it happens every morning. I had to go in and actually disconnect all of the database callbacks for all of the objects that were involved in that, and specifically do those things in the code, because it was taking so long to do this import that it just was untenable. We couldn't keep it going like that. So I ended up having to go in and just disable, and I mean, it was hundreds of callbacks. It was ridiculous. So we had to write stuff. write a little method to attach, to include into these models in this thing to disable all their callbacks, and then specifically do the things in the saves or the updates or whatever that we needed to do.
And
Because,
so you're saying that was more performant? So you were
oh
doing the
yeah,
same amount of work,
oh yeah.
but
Well,
it was more performant?
because every time we saved one of these objects, I didn't need it, in this case, I didn't need it to do the 500 callbacks it was doing. I only needed 2 of them, right, for this
Okay.
case. So,
Okay.
it was just running ridiculous amounts of callbacks because it's handling, all these different use cases, hundreds of different
Yeah,
use
yeah,
cases that
yeah.
it's dealing with. But there was no way to disconnect that stuff. There was no way to just say, hey, I just want to take this part, this use case, and do the things I need to do for that. It's like, hey, if you touch this object, you're doing it all, Jack. I don't care what you need it for, right? And that's no good. Uh, yeah, disabling the callbacks was, well, yes and no, because what we did is in this custom import poro, we wrote a little method that would intercept the callbacks and just bypass them. Basically say, hey, don't run this. If you're a callback, don't run. And then we could just include that when we called methods for those objects. So it was a bit of a pain, but probably not as bad as it could have been because I didn't have to go. Plus, we needed the callbacks for the other use cases. It's not like I'd have been completely rewriting the whole code base if I was disabling those because they're so interwoven in there. And that's one of the big problems is it's so easy to get sucked into violating single responsibility principle in models with these active record callbacks because it takes nothing to say, okay, after save, go do all this other stuff with all these other objects, right? I mean, that's just such a common pattern that I see, and it's bad. I mean, that's a bad thing to do. But it's so easy to do it, right? Because hey, if I can just put it in the model in an after save, then I don't have to write another, a higher level class to have it call the things that it should call and separate its responsibilities and keep all the models nice and tidy. I can just put it in an after save and forget about it. But then a couple years later, I come along and I have to suffer from the hell that is callbacks, right? And I mean,
You know what this kind of reminds me of? Um, go-tos.
oh yeah,
Like
oh
how
god,
go-tos are the easiest thing in the world to do and were used, once upon a time much more frequently, and they created basically hell in the code base.
hey, we got a problem. Troubleshoot this. Nope, they can just have the problem. Sorry, that's the way it's gonna stay forever. I ain't tracing that code. Yeah, those things were nasty, and it's kind of the same thing because it's like you mentioned earlier. These callbacks end up getting to be magic, where hey, I saved this record and this other crap happened. Where did that come from? Well, I go look at this callback. Okay, all that's doing is setting this thing and saving this object. Okay, well that object is got
Now
these
doing something
callbacks,
else.
and then
Yeah.
that's got these callbacks, and that's happened almost every time that I've run into a new code base and there's callbacks in it at all. I end up seeing these chains of callbacks that just confuse the crap out of me, and so it just makes it takes a lot longer to learn the code base, figure out what's going on, troubleshoot problems, trace things. After save is one of the worst callbacks. If it raises an exception, you have to deal with rollbacks, and that just gets a wee bit confusing. Yeah, absolutely right, Rick. Um, yeah, after save is, I would say, 90% of the offender when I've seen it in the wild. It's almost always that bloody thing. Because the before saves or the before creates are usually used to set some kind of default value that has to be calculated from something else that's set, right? That's typically not a really big deal. but the after saves, those are almost always bad. Because if I've already saved the record, I'm not changing something in the record. I would have done that in the before save, most likely. So if I'm in an after save, I'm usually doing something to some other object. So right away, that's just bad news. So if there's new programmers listening to this, I would say if you ever go to write an after save callback, you need to do a long, hard think about whether that's the right thing to be doing, because 99.999% of the time, it's not. And then you'll have a senior programmer telling you that you have to trace this code because I ain't doing it. So, I mean, so chat, does that, I mean, yeah, I've been ranting for a while because this is something that A, is fresh for me, and B, I really think is kind of problematic. I've never seen it work out well. But do you guys have like horror stories of, I know this isn't the Halloween episode, but horror stories of dealing with callbacks? Or is it just me being an old grumpy bastard?
Or are there any callbacks that you would just leave? Are there any callbacks that if you're starting a new project, would you still be putting in like before validations or before save do something? I mean, I'm
Yeah,
leaning more and more to no, but what's your opinion on it?
I absolutely, um, I'm not the only one. Okay, good. Good to know. I mean, I am an old grumpy bastard, but that's not the only reason callbacks are bad. So that's good. Um, but eh, yeah, I actively try to avoid those things because I am so scarred by those that it's like it makes my skin crawl when I see them. I'm like, oh God, here's another one of those things. I have to go fix this and get it the hell out of here. So, as I'm doing the code with Chris stuff and we're writing this new project and working through this new stuff, I seriously doubt that they will see me writing callbacks, active record callbacks, because I hate them. There may come a situation where it's okay, this is a good situation to use that, because there are such things, but they're extraordinarily rare. And if I am going to write one of those, I am going to do some serious thinking about, okay, is this actually what I want to be doing? And how is this going to kick my ass in 3 months? Because it will. So, um, wow, this was kind of a short rant actually, but
Yeah, I know.
but a fun one. I thought my notes looked longer than this, but yeah, the big things are, though, the speed issues and the insanely difficult troubleshooting when these strings of things happen. It's just not worth it, in my opinion.
When callbacks go bad.
Yeah, which is almost every time. I mean, I can't. I just can't come up anymore with a good reason to use them. I'm sure there's a case out there that there is, and there aren't better options, but I can't come up with them anymore. I just can't.
Well,
Um,
I mean, the thing about it is, and I mean, they're easy to implement, and
yeah,
therein lies the insidiousness of them, in that they're easy to implement. You can put them in. Hey, just fix my problem, or this deploy the feature. I'm all good. But then, as the code base goes and matures, if more are added, then that's when the problems start building up. So it's over time, the price gets paid.
yeah. Well, yeah, and I think that's
So, but like if you're doing kind of what you're talking about, like defining objects that say exist above it, that you can call those, and that those do more explicitly what you're wanting to accomplish as opposed to relying on callbacks. I think that's the more maintainable way to go,
Yeah.
even though, like you said, it does take a little bit more time to do that
Right.
than to throw something in an after save, excuse me, a before save, or even an after save.
Yeah.
Because you say, hey, I want to do this thing. I want to send an email after I process this transaction. Hey, after save callback. Hey, I want to do something else. All right, well, I'll put it in another after save callback, or I'll put it in the same method that's being called from that after save.
Right. Well, the other thing it
So
does.
it just builds and builds and creates, you know, like how GoTo's created spaghetti code. We're creating our
Yeah. Spaghetti
or
strings of
callback spaghetti
callbacks.
or whatever. Yeah.
Well, and the other thing it does too is it limits the flexibility of the objects that you use it in, because when you put these callbacks in there, then every time this happens on this object, this callback's going to run, which means if I want to use it a different way, I either have to rewrite this without, pull the callback out and refactor it to be able to use it some other way, or I have to write a completely different object that I'm going to use. Whereas if I don't have that in callbacks and I have super objects that do this thing, like let's take the order, for example. I may have a merchandise order that works very differently from a food order, which works very differently from a experience order, right? But I don't want to have 3 different order objects to deal with that stuff. And there may be settings and things with line items, like maybe one of these kind doesn't even have line items. It does totaling a completely different way, right? If my totaling is done in a callback in the order item, well, I've just screwed myself. Now I either have to go refactor that totaling out of that, which shouldn't have been there in the first place, or I have to write a completely different order sub item to handle totaling differently. And that's just bad. It just limits your flexibility. So I just really don't see callbacks as a good idea. I can't think of a specific example where they're good that I've run into. Sure, there's some out there. I can't think of any. Chat, maybe when is a good time to use a callback? When should you use one?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. When should you use one? And it like you, I'm leaning towards you shouldn't.
Yeah.
You can because it's easy, but that again, you're gonna start down the slippery slope.
Yeah, I mean, my contention is probably never. Is the answer to that question. I don't know. I mean, maybe chat has a different take on this. Maybe somebody has some examples of where there's not a bad. I mean, there are good times, but so Rick says, I just realized the listener thing I'd mentioned earlier is the observer pattern. I use the after commit outside the transaction to notify the observers. I mean, that's okay. That seems reasonable because, well, the only thing I would think about that is that the observers are other objects, right? So are you not reaching out to other objects from inside this particular model? And while that's probably splitting hairs, is that not the case? I mean, I don't know what your structure is, so I'm just imagining what you're doing. And I know that's a used pattern. It's not like I'm saying, hey, bad, Rick, bad. But I'm just trying to think through, well, is that actually violating the single responsibility principle by doing that? I don't know. Could be. Maybe not. Like if I were doing it at this point in my career, if I were doing that, I would actually have, like I said before, a super object that would save this thing to the model I'm trying to save, and then it would notify the observers. Because to me, that just seems more reliable, not more reliable, safer from a code perspective. I don't know. That's a tough one, chat. What do you think about that pattern? Is that really problematic? I mean, technically it violates single responsibility principle, but in that case, is that really a big deal? Do we care? Is that going to be problematic 6 months down the road when we're trying to trace things, or is that pattern nothing to worry about and it's a fine time to use those? I don't have the answer. I'm actually wondering. I'll have to do some thinking and research on that and see what I come up with. But I would be interested to hear what chat has to say. So drop some comments in the little comment boxes below when you're watching this video and let us know what you think about that. Because that is interesting. I could probably argue both sides of that.
I think having the other object would be more, having a object above them or whatever would be more explicit, but
I mean, yeah, I definitely agree with that, and that's probably how I would do it, but is that kind of overthinking that particular case? I'm just wondering if err on the side of caution and always do a super object. Because man, these callbacks have just always bitten me in the butt at some point. Every single time. But I don't know. Maybe like you said, the observer pattern isn't really that big of a deal, that because it only goes so far. It's not like your observers are going to have database callbacks that string together. Although I suppose they could, but interesting thing to think about. But anyway, I'm about out of notes. You got any other notes on this topic?
not really.
No, me either. I kind of figured this would be a little short, but not this short.
But we did propose, hey, it would be great to try to find someone who is pro callbacks and one who is not. Whereas unfortunately, both of us are both on the anti callback for the most
yeah.
part.
Yeah, it seems that way.
Yeah. So.
But hey, we would like to hear from people who are pro callback and can articulate some reasons why maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe there are good times to use this, and maybe that is the best solution in certain use cases. I would absolutely love to hear some of those, because I always like to learn new things. So if you know something about that, if you have some opinions on that, make sure you drop those in the comments and let us know.
Yep.
So hope you guys enjoyed that show. I know it's a little short, but you know, it is what it is. It's a rough time of year for both of us, so we're trying to stay ahead. But here we are. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you did, please make sure to mash that like button. Subscribe. Rebuilt says callbacks are bad. I agree, sir. You better believe it. But yeah, mash that subscribe button. Hit the like. Give us a follow if you're watching this on Twitch. You know, just mash all the buttons and ding all the bells. You know how that saying goes. So also, if you are wanting to listen to this on a podcast, you can find it everywhere that podcasts live. You can find us on rubberduckdevshow.com. You can find us on Twitter at DuckyDevShow. I usually post stuff on there about how we're doing. Tomorrow, is the day for Code with Chris from 3 to 5 Eastern time. However, I'm in Central Florida and we have a big old hurricane. Well, it's not that big. It's a Cat 1, but
Hurricane number 2.
yeah, coming our way. Supposed to hit tomorrow. So it's very possible I will lose power. I'm going to try to do Code with Chris. I want to, but pay attention to Twitter because I will let you guys know whether that can go ahead or not. And if you don't hear from me tomorrow, it's not anything nefarious. It's just because I'm likely sitting in a very dark house with no power and can't communicate. So, but I will try to keep everyone updated on Twitter. So make sure you follow us over there at Ducky Dev Show, so you can keep up with what's going on. We will be back here next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Probably just the two of us again, and we have no idea what we're going to talk about. So, hey, if you guys got suggestions, drop them in the comments below or hit me up on Twitter, and we will take your suggestions. Otherwise, we'll come up with something somehow, sometime, and let you know on Twitter. Also, tomorrow, 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern time, I'll be doing Code with Chris, so we'll work on that project some. We'll be getting a little more organized. We've just been doing some playing around, but we're going to try to make some decent progress tomorrow. And we'll be taking a look at a few things and having some fun. So until then, I hope you guys enjoyed this. We will see you hopefully tomorrow. And happy programming.
Happy programming.
Bye.